3 days after I buried my husband, his executive assistant called my phone at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night, her voice shaking, and said 11 words that undid everything I thought I understood about the last decade of my life. I don't know how to tell you this, but he's alive. I sat on my kitchen floor for a full minute after she said it, phone still pressed to my ear, genuinely unsure whether I'd misheard her or whether grief had finally, fully broken something in my mind. It hadn't. What she told me next explained not just an impossible phone call, but 11 years of business trips, sealed accounts, and a funeral I'd planned for a man who was very much still breathing. If you've ever discovered that the person you trusted most had been building an entire hidden life alongside the one you shared, stay with me. Because this is the story of the 3 days that followed that phone call, and what I found when I finally understood exactly what my husband had done. My name is Kathleen, and 10 days before that phone call, I had stood at the front of a church, in black, accepting condolences from nearly 200 people for a man named Richard who I believed, with absolute certainty, had died of a heart attack on a business trip to Denver. Richard ran a mid-sized commercial real estate investment firm, the kind of business that required frequent travel, site visits, investor meetings, closings in cities across the country. Over our 14 years of marriage, Richard had probably spent a third of his nights in hotel rooms, a pattern so consistent and so mundane that I'd stopped tracking it closely years earlier, trusting the rhythm of his career the way you trust the weather. The call came on a Thursday morning. Richard's assistant, a competent, unfailingly professional woman named Deborah, who'd worked for him for almost 9 years, phoned me directly, her voice already breaking, to tell me that Richard had collapsed during a morning meeting in Denver, that paramedics had been unable to revive him, that he'd been pronounced dead at a hospital I'd never heard of, in a city I'd never visited, more than 1,000 miles from home. What followed was the specific, numbing logistics of sudden grief, arranging for his body to be transported home, coordinating with a funeral home, calling family, calling his business partners, standing in a church accepting the particular condolences people offer when a death has been sudden rather than expected. A closed casket, Deborah had gently explained, quoting the funeral director's recommendation, given the nature of the medical event. I hadn't questioned it. Why would I have questioned it? Grief doesn't leave much room for forensic skepticism. I buried my husband on a Saturday, surrounded by 200 people who loved him, or believed they did, all of us equally convinced we were mourning something real. 3 days after that funeral, on a Tuesday night, my phone rang at 11 o'clock. I almost didn't answer it. I'd spent that entire week in the specific fog that follows a funeral, when the initial adrenaline of managing logistics fades and the actual weight of loss finally starts to settle in. The caller ID showed Deborah's name, and I answered mostly out of reflex, assuming she needed something related to Richard's business affairs, some final piece of paperwork that required my signature. Her voice, when she spoke, was shaking in a way I'd never heard from her before, not even during the chaos of the funeral arrangements. "Kathleen," she said, "I need you to sit down. I don't know how to tell you this, but he's alive. Richard is alive." I want to describe exactly what happened in my body when she said this, because I think it's important to understanding everything that followed. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel relief. I felt something closer to a specific, vertiginous horror, the sensation of an entire, carefully constructed understanding of my recent life suddenly folding in on itself, with no clear floor underneath to catch me. "That's not possible," I said. "Deborah, I buried him. I stood at his funeral 3 days ago." "I know," she said, and I could hear her crying now, the particular crying of someone who has been carrying something enormous and has finally reached the point where she can't carry it silently anymore. "Kathleen, I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand I've only just found out myself, or I would have told you sooner. I would have told you before the funeral, if I'd known." I want to walk through what Deborah told me that night carefully, because the full picture only assembled itself gradually, over the course of a conversation that lasted nearly 3 hours. Deborah had worked for Richard for 9 years, managing his calendar, his travel arrangements, his correspondence, the full scope of an executive assistant's responsibilities for a man who traveled constantly and delegated heavily. Over those 9 years, She'd developed the kind of intimate, granular knowledge of Richard's professional life that comes with genuinely competent, long-term administrative support. About 6 years into her employment, Deborah told me, she'd begun noticing irregularities in Richard's travel patterns that didn't quite match his stated itineraries. Business trips that were booked to one city but for which she occasionally found evidence, a receipt, a hotel confirmation email accidentally CC'd to her, placing him somewhere else entirely. At first, she told me, she'd assumed these were simple scheduling errors, the kind of small discrepancies that happen when someone travels as frequently as Richard did. But the pattern persisted, and eventually solidified into something Deborah could no longer explain away as clerical confusion. Richard, it turned out, had been maintaining a second, entirely separate life for nearly 8 years. A second household, in a city 4 states away, under a name that was not his own. His name there is Robert Callahan, Deborah told me, her voice still unsteady. He has a whole different identity, Kathleen, a different social circle. I think, she paused, and I could hear her working up to the hardest part of what she needed to tell me. I think there's a whole other family there too. I need to slow down here, because I think the specifics matter enormously to understanding the scale of what my husband had built, over nearly a decade, in the spaces between the life I thought I fully knew. Under the name Robert Callahan, Richard had, according to what Deborah had pieced together, and what I would later confirm through considerably more painful means, established a second household in a city he visited under the guise of quarterly investor meetings. Meetings that were real, it turned out, but that occupied only a fraction of the actual time he spent there. He had, in that second life, a partner, a woman named Christine, who believed, as I had believed about him, that she knew the entirety of who he was. He had, with Christine, 2 children, ages 9 and 6, who had grown up believing their father traveled frequently for a consulting business, unaware that the man they called Dad maintained an entire separate marriage, an entire separate identity, 1,000 miles away. The mechanics of how Richard had sustained this for 8 years without discovery were, in their own dark way, a testament to a particular kind of meticulous discipline. Separate bank accounts, structured carefully to avoid triggering questions from either household's finances, a business travel schedule genuinely demanding enough to provide cover for the frequency of his absences, a second phone, which Deborah had apparently glimpsed once, years earlier, and been told, plausibly enough at the time, was for a confidential business matter she didn't need details about. What had finally cracked this arrangement open, Deborah explained, was the collapse in Denver, an actual medical event, it turned out, a genuine cardiac episode, but one from which Richard had, in fact, survived, contrary to what both Deborah and I had initially been told. Here is where the story becomes almost impossible to believe, and yet, every detail of it was eventually confirmed through hospital records, police reports, and Richard's own eventual, halting admission. Richard had genuinely collapsed during a business meeting in Denver, a real cardiac event, serious enough that paramedics were called and he was rushed to a hospital. But in the chaos of that emergency, something had gone catastrophically, almost unbelievably wrong. The hospital had confused Richard's identification with that of another patient, a man of similar age and general description who had been brought in around the same time from an unrelated incident and who had, in fact, died shortly after arrival. The hospital, working from incomplete information during a chaotic emergency intake, had contacted Deborah, listed as Richard's emergency contact through his business, since his wallet contained his business cards more prominently than personal identification, and informed her that Richard Ashford had died. Deborah, devastated and moving quickly through the specific bureaucratic fog that follows a sudden death, had called me, and the machinery of funeral arrangements had begun before anyone caught the error. Richard, meanwhile, alive though badly shaken by his cardiac episode, moved to a different section of the hospital during the confusion of that chaotic night, sedated for much of the following 2 days as doctors stabilized him, had been unreachable, unaware that the outside world believed him dead, unaware that a funeral was being planned in his name 1,000 miles away. It was only when Richard, recovering enough to check his phone 3 days later, saw dozens of missed calls and a string of increasingly frantic texts from Christine, his second life partner, who had somehow heard through a mutual business contact that Richard Ashford had died in Denver and was desperately trying to understand what that meant for the man she knew as Robert Callahan, that the full, tangled catastrophe of the mistaken identity began to unravel. I want to be honest about how disorienting it was, sitting on my kitchen floor at nearly 2 in the morning, piecing this together with Deborah in real time, both of us equally stunned by the sheer scale of what we were discovering. Richard, once he understood the mistake, had apparently spent the better part of a day in a state of genuine panic, not, as I initially assumed when Deborah first told me all this, primarily out of relief at having survived, but out of a much colder, more calculating panic about how to manage the collision of his two separate lives, now that both women in them had somehow learned, within the same week, that something had gone catastrophically wrong. He had called Deborah first, not me, his actual legal wife, but his assistant, the person who had unwittingly served as the connective tissue of his professional double life for years. He'd asked her, according to what she told me, to help him figure out how to handle this quietly. A request that Deborah, to her genuine credit, had refused outright the moment she understood what he was actually asking her to help him cover up. "I told him I wasn't going to lie to you," Deborah said, her voice hardening slightly as she recounted this part. "I told him I'd already spent 9 years managing his schedule, without asking too many questions. I probably should have asked, but I wasn't going to help him manage a fake death on top of everything else. That's when I called you." I met Richard 2 days after that phone call, in a sterile hospital conference room that the facility's administration had arranged, given the unusual and legally complicated nature of the situation. A genuine hospital identification error that had triggered a funeral for a living patient was not, apparently, a situation their standard procedures had ever anticipated. I want to describe what it felt like seeing him, because I think it's the part of this story people are most curious about, and the honest answer is more complicated than either relief or rage, though both were present. He looked smaller than I remembered, still recovering from the cardiac event, his color not yet fully returned, his hands trembling slightly as he sat across from me in that conference room. For a moment, before anything else settled into place, I felt something that startled me. A flicker of the same instinctive concern I'd felt for this man across 14 years of marriage. A body's memory of caring for someone that didn't immediately know how to reconcile with everything I'd learned in the previous 48 hours. "Kathleen," he said, and his voice cracked on my name in a way that, under any other circumstances, might have moved me. "I don't know where to start." "Start with her name," I said. "The real story. All of it. I've already heard the outline from Deborah. I want to hear you say it." What followed was nearly 2 hours of the most difficult conversation of my life, during which Richard confirmed, in halting, deeply uncomfortable detail, everything Deborah had pieced together and more. He had met Christine 8 years earlier, during a business trip that had, in his account, started as an affair before evolving, gradually, into something he described as a whole second life I didn't plan for, and then didn't know how to undo. He described the specific, escalating logistics of maintaining 2 households, the separate identity, obtained through what amounted to identity fraud that I won't detail further here, the separate finances, the elaborate scheduling required to sustain plausible deniability across both lives for nearly a decade. I asked him the question that mattered most to me in that conference room, more than any of the logistical details. "Did you ever plan to tell me? Either of us? Or was this just going to continue indefinitely?" Richard didn't have a good answer for that. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's something instructive in the fact that a man capable of sustaining this level of elaborate deception for 8 years genuinely seemed to have no actual plan for how it was supposed to end, no endgame, no eventual resolution he'd been quietly working toward. It had simply continued, indefinitely, sustained by his own capacity for compartmentalization and, frankly, by considerable luck, until an unrelated hospital's clerical error had finally, catastrophically forced the collision he'd apparently never planned for. "I don't know," he finally said. "I think some part of me just kept believing I could keep both going forever, and I never let myself think past that. I want to address something important here, because I think it matters to how this story ultimately resolved. Christine was, in every meaningful sense, as much a victim of Richard's deception as I was. I reached out to her, about a week after that hospital conference room conversation, an exchange that neither of us had anticipated needing to have, but that both of us, in the end, found strangely necessary. She had believed, for 8 years, that she was Robert Callahan's wife in every sense that mattered to her. Legally, she would later discover, their marriage certificate had been filed under falsified identification, meaning her actual legal status was considerably murkier than she'd ever imagined. A devastating discovery layered on top of everything else she was processing. Our conversation was brief, careful, and ultimately more compassionate toward each other than either of us initially expected it to be, given the circumstances. "I keep trying to figure out what I actually knew," she told me, her voice carrying the same specific disorientation I recognized in my own. 9 years, 2 kids, and I don't even know if any of it was legally real. We didn't become friends, exactly, in the aftermath of everything that unraveled, but we developed something like mutual, careful respect. 2 women who had both been genuinely deceived by the same man, neither of us the villain in the other's story, both of us navigating an identical, specific betrayal from different sides of a life we'd never known was divided. The months that followed involved considerably more legal complexity than either Christine or I had anticipated, given the unusual circumstances of Richard's fraudulent second identity. Because Richard's marriage to Christine had been conducted under a falsified identity, it was ultimately determined to be legally void, which meant that our marriage, the one legally recognized from the start, 14 years running by that point, remained the only legally valid one, a fact that carried significant financial and legal implications for how everything eventually resolved. I filed for divorce within a month of that hospital conference room conversation, a considerably faster process than most divorces, given that Richard, facing potential identity fraud charges related to his second identity, had limited appetite for a protracted legal fight over assets he was more concerned about protecting from criminal exposure. The financial settlement, when it finally resolved, reflected 14 years of a marriage I'd believed, until 3 days after a funeral, had been entirely as it appeared. Deborah, remarkably, remained employed at Richard's firm throughout this entire period, having reported what she'd discovered to the firm's board once the full scope of Richard's fraudulent identity became clear. Information that triggered its own separate set of consequences for Richard's standing at the company he'd built, given that maintaining a fraudulent legal identity carried implications well beyond his personal life. I've spent considerable time, in the period since all of this unfolded, trying to understand what parts of my 14-year marriage had been genuinely real, and what parts had simply been camouflage for the life Richard was building elsewhere. I don't think the answer is as simple as, none of it was real, though I understand why that's the instinctive conclusion many people reach when they hear a story like this one. Richard's affection toward our own children, his engagement with our actual shared life during the considerable portion of time he genuinely spent at home, his professional success, which was entirely legitimate and not connected to his fraudulent second identity, these things existed, alongside an entirely separate, secretly maintained life that ran in parallel to everything I believed was the whole of our marriage. What I've come to understand, gradually, is that Richard was a man capable of an extraordinary, almost pathological degree of compartmentalization, capable of genuinely loving 2 separate families, in 2 separate cities, under 2 separate names, without apparently experiencing the kind of internal conflict that might have eventually forced a resolution. That capacity doesn't make either family's experience of him less genuine on its own terms. It just means the full truth of who he actually was existed nowhere that either Christine or I, individually, ever had access to. I think about that funeral often, the one I planned, genuinely grieving, for a man who turned out to be very much alive, sedated 3 floors away, in the same hospital that had mistakenly declared him dead. There's something specifically disorienting about having genuinely mourned someone who wasn't actually gone, only to discover that the version of him you were mourning, a devoted husband of 14 years, a man whose only secrets you assumed were the ordinary, forgivable kind, had never fully existed in the way you believed. I grieved a man who died in Denver. The man who survived that hospital, and who I met 2 days later in that sterile conference room, was someone considerably more complicated, and in important ways, someone I'd never actually known at all. I've had to make peace with grieving 2 different things simultaneously. The marriage I believed I had, which genuinely doesn't exist anymore in any form, real or otherwise, and the literal physical man, who survived a cardiac event, but whose actual character, once fully revealed, made the marriage I'd mourned feel almost more truly lost than if he had in fact died in that Denver hospital, as originally reported. The divorce finalized about 8 months after that phone call from Deborah. Richard faced legal consequences related to the fraudulent identity, though considerably less severe than I initially expected, given the specific legal complexities involved in prosecuting a case with this particular combination of circumstances. I've rebuilt my life in the time since, slowly, in the way you rebuild anything after discovering the foundation you believed was solid was actually built over a hidden fault line the entire time. Deborah and I have remained in occasional contact, an unusual friendship, born entirely out of a shared, bizarre catastrophe, but a genuine one nonetheless, built on the fact that she chose honesty over covering for Richard, at real professional risk to herself, the moment she understood what he was actually asking of her. I don't know what became of Christine's relationship with her children's understanding of their father, and I've made peace with not knowing. Some parts of this story were never fully mine to follow to their conclusion. I don't know if there's a clean, tidy lesson in a story this strange, but I've landed on something I think is worth sharing. Some deceptions are so elaborate, so meticulously maintained, that no amount of ordinary vigilance would have caught them. This wasn't a case of ignored red flags or willful blindness on my part. Richard's second life was specifically engineered to be undetectable, and it very nearly remained that way indefinitely, undone not by any mistake of his own making, but by a completely unrelated hospital error that happened to force a collision he'd never planned for. What I take from this, more than anything, is a strange, complicated gratitude that the truth came out at all, however chaotic and painful the mechanism. I would rather know the full, devastating truth about the last 14 years of my life than continue believing a version of it that was only ever half real. The grief of learning it was enormous. But it was, in the end, a truer grief than the one I felt at that funeral, mourning something that had never actually been what I believed it was in the first place. If this story left you as stunned as it left me living through it, I want you to remember something. The truth, however devastating, is almost always better than a life built on a foundation you never got to actually see. If something in your own life doesn't quite add up, it deserves a closer look. Not out of paranoia, but out of respect for your own right to know the actual shape of your life. If this story hit you the way it hit me, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments, have you ever discovered something about someone close to you that completely rewrote your understanding of them? I read every single comment, and next week, I've got another story I think a lot of you are going to need.